The sedative needle was less than an inch from the veteran's vein when the German Shepherd K9 slammed the doctor's hand away. The syringe shattered beneath the crash cart. Nurses screamed. Security rushed in with a catch-pole, ready to drag the dog out like a threat. But Ranger did not bite. He did not run. Bleeding from one ear, the wounded K9 planted himself across the doorway of Trauma Room 3 and dropped a bloody dog tag at rookie nurse Emily Carter's feet. The tag spun once under the ER light. Harlan, use MC Recon. Behind her, charge nurse Linda Marsh snapped, "Carter, don't touch that." Then the veteran opened his eyes, stared at the tag, and whispered the words that silenced the room. "Don't let them bury him twice. If you believe one quiet nurse can hear the truth before anyone else will, stay with her." For a moment, Mercy Ridge Hospital seemed to freeze around that sentence. The monitor beside the bed kept shrieking, but nobody moved toward it. The security guard holding the catch-pole stopped with one boot halfway over the threshold. Dr. Whitmore, the senior physician on duty, lowered his hand from his struck wrist and stared not at the dog, not at the patient, but at the tag lying near Emily's shoes. That was the first thing Emily noticed. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Ranger noticed too. The German Shepherd stood with his shoulders squared and his injured paw trembling against the tile, but he did not shift his weight away from the room. His body blocked the doorway as cleanly as a locked gate. His ears remained forward. His eyes stayed on Dr. Whitmore for 2 hard seconds, then moved back to Caleb Ward, the unidentified veteran strapped to the trauma bed. Caleb's name had come from his own broken whisper when the paramedics found him outside the ambulance bay. He had collapsed in the rain with one hand wrapped around Ranger's leash and the other pressed to his chest. He carried no wallet, no phone, no service card, and no contact number. By the time the stretcher reached the emergency room, the story had already been written by people who thought they were being practical. Unstable veteran, possible faker, combative, no confirmed military record, dangerous dog. Emily had heard each label pass from mouth to mouth while she cut away Caleb's soaked jacket and checked the scars across his ribs. The scars were old, uneven, and too deliberate to be explained by street fights or random accidents. One ran beneath his collarbone like a pale rope. Another disappeared under the edge of his gown. When Ranger had pressed his muzzle against Caleb's hand during intake, Caleb's heart rate had steadied for almost 12 seconds. Emily had been the only one watching the monitor then. Now she looked at the dog tag. Linda stepped closer, voice low and sharp. "Carter, I said don't touch it." Emily reached slowly into her scrub pocket and pulled out gloves. She felt the eyes of the room on her back. She was 26 years old, 3 weeks into her first emergency room rotation, and everyone at Mercy Ridge still treated her like a student who had wandered into the wrong hallway. She checked wristbands twice. She read medication notes carefully. She asked questions when symptoms did not match the chart. To Emily, that was nursing. To Linda, it was hesitation. "Emily," Linda said, using her first name now the way supervisors did when they wanted obedience to feel personal. "Step away." But Ranger lowered his head and nudged the tag toward Emily with the edge of his muzzle. It was not a wild movement. It was deliberate, almost formal. The dog had brought the object to her, placed it in the open, and waited. His breathing was rough from pain, but his control never broke. Emily had grown up around working dogs because her father had trained police K9s before his back injury ended his career. He used to tell her that a trained dog under pressure did not waste movement. Fear scattered, training focused. Ranger was focused. Emily put on the gloves and lifted the tag by the broken chain. The metal was colder than she expected. Old blood had dried along one edge and settled into the stamped letters. The chain had not simply snapped. One link had been twisted almost flat, as if torn under force. This was not a necklace dropped in a parking lot. This had been ripped from someone, carried, hidden, or protected long enough for the blood to darken into rust-colored crust. She turned it under the trauma lights. Harlan, USMC Recon. Caleb's breathing changed. It was a small sound, but Ranger reacted instantly. The dog's head snapped toward the bed. Caleb's eyes were open again, glassy with pain, fixed on the tag in Emily's hand. His lips moved as if he were trying to push words through years of silence. The restraint around his wrist creaked when his fingers curled toward the air. Dr. Whitmore took one step forward. "Sedate him." Ranger's growl returned, low and controlled. Emily raised her free hand before the nurse beside the medication cart could reach for another syringe. "Wait, he's responding. He's agitated," Whitmore said. "He recognized the name. He is not in a condition to recognize anything reliably." Emily looked at Caleb's face and knew that was not true. Confusion drifted. This did not. The sight of that name had struck him with the force of memory. It had found something buried deep and alive. Caleb swallowed. His voice came out dry and broken. Harlan stayed. The room absorbed those two words without understanding them. Linda exhaled in irritation, but Dr. Whitmore went still again. It lasted only a second. His face closed almost immediately, smooth and professional. But Emily had already seen the crack beneath it. Harlan stayed where, Mr. Ward? Emily asked. Whitmore's tone cut across her question. Nurse Carter. You are done. Ranger stepped sideways, blocking Whitmore's path to Emily. The movement was so precise that even the security guards hesitated. The dog did not bare his teeth. He did not jump. He simply placed his wounded body between the doctor and the tag, eyes forward, spine rigid, as if obeying an order no one else in the ER had heard. Linda's voice hardened. That dog is interfering with care. Emily kept the tag in her gloved palm. He stopped a sedative from reaching a patient who may be trying to give us critical information. He stopped a physician, Linda said, and you are defending him. Emily felt fear rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She was not brave in the way people imagined bravery. Her hand shook when she had to call families. Her stomach tightened every time a senior nurse corrected her in public. She had spent most of her life being the quiet person in the room because quiet people survived longer. But there was a difference between being quiet and being blind. Caleb looked at her as if he had found one face in the room that had not already turned away. His lips trembled. They said he ran. Emily leaned closer, careful not to cross Ranger's guarded line. Who said that? Caleb's eyes shifted toward Dr. Whitmore. It was subtle, almost nothing. But Ranger saw it, and so did Emily, Doctor. Whitmore's expression did not change. This is exactly why he needs sedation. He is confused, suggestible, and escalating. Caleb's fingers tightened again. His voice broke. No, he held the door. Ranger's ears lifted sharply. The dog's entire posture changed at those words. Not softened, sharpened. He lowered his chest an inch, as if preparing to obey a remembered command. Emily looked from Caleb to Ranger and felt the first shape of the truth pressing through the chaos. This was not a random dog guarding a random man. Ranger knew something in Caleb's voice. Caleb knew something in that tag. And Dr. Whitmore wanted both silenced. The guard with the catch pole moved again. Ranger turned his head, not enough to abandon Caleb, only enough to warn. The guard stopped. Linda stepped beside Emily and spoke through clenched teeth. Hand me the tag. Emily closed her fingers around it. No, she said. I'm documenting it as patient property and possible evidence. The word evidence changed the room. A few nurses looked toward Dr. Whitmore. One resident took half a step back from the medication cart. Even the guard lowered the catch pole a fraction, suddenly aware that what lay in Emily's hand might no longer be just an object. Linda's face flushed. You are a rookie nurse, not an investigator. I'm also not going to throw away something brought in with an unidentified patient. It was brought in by an animal. A trained K9, Emily said. Ranger's ears flicked once toward her voice. For the first time, Caleb's eyes softened, not with relief, not yet. With recognition of someone finally naming things correctly, Dr. Whitmore's voice dropped. Remove Nurse Carter from this room. The order landed hard. Emily felt it in her chest before anyone touched her. This was how careers cracked in hospitals. Not always through big mistakes, but through small refusals witnessed by the wrong people. Linda had the authority to write her up. Whitmore had the influence to make sure no one trusted her judgment again. Emily knew that. She knew exactly how fragile her place here was. Then Caleb turned his head toward Ranger and forced out two words. Hold line. Ranger dropped instantly into a guarded down across the doorway. Chest to the floor, eyes forward. Body blocking trauma room 3 with perfect discipline. The ER went silent. No one could pretend anymore that this was ordinary aggression. No one could call it panic. A wounded German shepherd had just obeyed a battlefield command from a half-conscious veteran. Everyone had dismissed as unstable. Emily looked at the dog tag in her hand, then at Ranger, then at Caleb Ward. Linda leaned close enough that only Emily could hear her final warning. If you keep listening to that dog, Carter, this will be your last shift at Mercy Ridge. Emily did not answer. Because Ranger was staring past everyone now, toward the dark hallway where the old records room sat locked behind a badge-only door, and in her palm, the bloody name of E. Harlan felt less like a mystery than a plea that had finally reached the right person. Linda's warning still hung beside Emily's ear when Ranger shifted his eyes toward the dark records hallway. He remained flat across the trauma room doorway, chest to the floor, body tense but obedient after Caleb's broken command. The ER staff had gone quiet in the strange way people did when something impossible became too visible to dismiss. A wounded German shepherd had just obeyed a phrase no one in the room had expected. A veteran labeled unstable had spoken a dead Marine's name with grief sharp enough to cut through sedation orders, and Emily Carter, who had been warned not to touch the dog tag, was still holding it in her gloved hand. She could feel every career-ending possibility pressing around her. Dr. Whitmore recovered first. Men like him always did. His face smoothed into the calm authority of someone who knew the room would usually bend back toward him. He told the guards to hold position, told the resident to prepare a lower dose, told Linda to clear unnecessary personnel, and told Emily to step outside with the property bag as if all of this were nothing more than procedure being restored. Emily did not argue. Not there. Not with Caleb struggling for air and Ranger listening to every voice like each one might become a threat. She took one small step backward, then another, keeping the dog tag visible in her palm. Ranger tracked her movement but did not leave the doorway. That mattered. If he had been possessive of the metal, he would have followed it. If he had been simply aggressive, he would have challenged everyone. Instead, he stayed with Caleb and allowed Emily to carry the tag away. He trusted her with it. That realization settled in her chest with more weight than Linda's threat. At the counter outside Trauma Room 3, Emily opened a clear patient property envelope. Her hands wanted to tremble, so she forced them into careful movements. Tag, broken chain, visible dried blood, marking USMC Recon, received in ear with unidentified patient Caleb Ward, presented by trained K9 at bedside. She paused over the word presented. It was not a medical term. It was not neutral enough. She could already hear Linda criticizing it. But no other word felt accurate. Ranger had not dropped the tag by accident. He had placed it where Emily would see it. She wrote it anyway. A nurse from the next bay leaned over just enough to glance at the envelope. "So we're charting dog testimony now?" A few people laughed, not loudly. But enough. Emily kept writing. She had learned that mockery in hospitals rarely came as a slap. It came as a dozen smolks, each one easy to deny. A look when she asked a question. A sigh when she double-checked a dose. A joke when she stayed 2 minutes longer with a frightened patient. She was not hated at Mercy Ridge. That would have been simpler. She was dismissed. Tonight, that dismissal had a sharper edge. Inside the trauma room, Caleb turned his face away from the medication cart. His eyes were open but unfocused, dragged between the present and someplace his body had never left. The restraint around his right wrist had rubbed a red mark into his skin. When a metal instrument slipped on the tray, he flinched so hard the monitor spiked. "There," the resident said. "Agitation." Emily looked up. That was a startled response. Linda gave her a look that could have closed a door. Emily lowered her voice. His pulse steadied when Ranger stayed near him. "His pulse is unstable because he is unstable," Linda said. But Emily had been watching more than the numbers. Caleb did not fight when Emily adjusted his oxygen. He did not curse when a nurse checked his IV site. He panicked only when Ranger was threatened, when the sedative approached, or when Dr. Whitmore stepped too close to the tag. His fear had a pattern. A pattern was not chaos. A pattern meant there was something to understand. Ranger understood it already. The K9 did not block Emily when she returned to the doorway. His eyes moved to her hands first, confirming the tag had not disappeared, then shifted to Caleb. Blood still darkened the fur beneath his ear. His injured paw had begun to leave a faint red mark on the tile. No one had treated him. Everyone was too busy deciding whether to remove him. Emily took a gauze pad from the supply cart and crouched just outside his reach. "Easy," she said softly. Ranger watched her. She did not reach for his head. Her father's old lessons rose in her memory, quiet and practical. Never crowd a working dog. Never reward panic. Never mistake discipline for friendliness. Emily folded the gauze and slid it across the floor toward him instead of touching him. Ranger lowered his nose, sniffed once, then ignored the gauze and looked back at Caleb. Not pain first, handler first. Emily swallowed the ache that rose in her throat. Dr. Whitmore appeared beside the doorway. His white coat still marked where the syringe had splashed. "Animal control is on the way." Ranger's reaction was immediate, but not what anyone expected. He did not growl at Whitmore this time. He did not look toward the ambulance entrance or the guards. His head turned slowly down the hall past the nurse's station, past the locked medication room, toward the old records corridor where the overhead light flickered above a badge-only door. Emily followed his gaze. The sign on the door read, "Archives, authorized personnel only." Most staff ignored that hallway. Mercy Ridge had gone digital years ago, but older paper records remained boxed behind that door, waiting for scanning, auditing, or disposal. Emily had passed it during night shift orientation and remembered the stale smell of dust and cardboard drifting from underneath. Linda had joked that only lawsuits and ghosts lived in there. Ranger stared at it as if someone had called his name from the other side. Emily felt the envelope in her pocket shift when she stood. Linda noticed. "Give me the property bag," Linda said. "It needs to be logged." "I'll log it." Emily met her eyes. "I already started the chain of custody." The phrase came from a hospital training module most people clicked through while eating lunch. Emily had actually read it. Linda's expression tightened with fresh irritation, the kind that came when someone underestimated a person and then found one locked door in them. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be," Linda said. Emily looked through the glass at Caleb. He had gone pale again. Sweat shining at his temples, his lips moved silently. Ranger lifted his head, watching him with alarming focus, then gave one sharp, contained whine. Emily stepped into the room before anyone stopped her. Caleb's oxygen cannula had slipped slightly. She corrected it, checked the line, and watched his pulse settle by a few beats when Ranger's nose touched the side of the mattress. The K9 never climbed onto the bed. He never broke working distance. He simply placed himself close enough for Caleb to know he was not alone. "Mr. Ward," Emily said, keeping her voice low, "can you hear me?" His eyes found hers. There was suspicion there, but not of her exactly. More like a man who had learned that every room could turn against him once he started telling the truth. "They said psych?" he rasped. "No decision has been made," Emily said. It was not fully true, and they both seemed to know it. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the door, where Ranger stood between him and the guards. "They always say that first." Emily felt the words land deep. Always. Not tonight only. Not this hospital only. Caleb Ward had been dismissed before, labeled before, handled before. The chart was not creating a story. Was repeating one. Dr. Whitmore entered behind her. Ranger rose immediately. "Out, Nurse Carter," he said. Emily did not move quickly enough. Whitmore looked at the resident. Document refusal of medication, escalating behavior, and interference by animal. "We'll transfer him for psychiatric evaluation once security clears the dog." Caleb's eyes sharpened with fear. No, the word was not loud, but the monitor reacted as if it were. His heart rate climbed. His hand pulled against the strap. Ranger stepped closer to the bed, shoulders rigid. Emily turned toward Whitmore. "He has chest pain, possible dehydration, an untreated stress response, and no verified history. Moving him before medical clearance could make him worse." Whitmore's stare cut into her. "You are not here to debate." That was what Mercy Ridge had been teaching her since she arrived. Do not debate. Do not question. Do not notice too much. Follow the voice with the longest title. Accept the chart before the patient. Accept the label before the story. But Caleb was looking at her with a terror that did not belong to ordinary confusion. "They locked it away," he whispered. Emily's breath caught. "Locked what away?" His eyes flicked toward the hallway. Ranger turned at the same time, not toward the exit, not toward animal control, whose distant doors had just opened with a cold metallic bang, toward archives. The dog moved before anyone could grab the leash. Not fast enough to seem wild, but with sudden purpose, limping out of the trauma room and down the hall. The guard shouted. Linda called Emily's name. Dr. Whitmore ordered someone to stop him. Ranger ignored them all. He reached the locked records door, pressed his bloody paw against the bottom seam, and lowered his nose to the thin line of darkness beneath it. Then he gave one short, controlled scratch against the metal. Emily stopped behind him. From inside the old records room came the faint sound of a file drawer sliding shut. From inside the old records room came the faint sound of a file drawer sliding shut. Emily stopped so abruptly that Linda nearly collided with her from behind. Ranger remained at the base of the locked door, nose pressed to the narrow seam where cold air leaked from beneath the metal. His bloody paw left a partial print on the floor, dark red against the pale tile, the hallway behind them filled with footsteps, radio static, and breath held too tightly by people who had followed a wounded K9 without wanting to admit they were following him. Linda reached for Emily's arm, but Emily stepped just out of reach. "There's someone inside," Emily said. Linda's face hardened. "Archives are badge access only after midnight. That means someone with access is inside." The statement was quiet, but it changed the shape of the hallway. One of the security guards looked at the reader beside the door as if it had suddenly become important. Dr. Whitmore arrived last, moving with controlled irritation rather than hurry. He did not look surprised enough. Emily noticed that before she noticed anything else. Ranger noticed him too. The K9 turned his head, still crouched near the door, and fixed his amber eyes on Whitmore. There was no growl this time. The silence was worse. It was the silence of an animal measuring a threat and waiting for the next wrong move. Whitmore looked at the guard. "Open it." The guard hesitated. Doctor, if there's someone inside, we should identify who accessed it. We are not turning a hospital hallway into an investigation because a dog scratched a door, Whitmore said. Emily kept her hand over the property envelope in her scrub pocket. The dog tag inside seemed to press against her ribs through the thin fabric, as if the name stamped into it had weight beyond metal. E. Harlan, USMC Recon, a dead Marine. If Caleb's broken words meant what she feared they meant, a man who had stayed behind. A man someone had buried once in a report and perhaps again in this hospital. The lock clicked. Ranger stood immediately, but he did not charge. He shifted backward just enough to give the door room to open, then placed himself beside Emily's left leg, not in front of her this time, beside her. The position felt deliberate, protective without blocking her view. The door opened on darkness and stale paper. A young records clerk named Mason stood inside with one hand on a file drawer and the other gripping a stack of folders against his chest. His eyes were wide behind crooked glasses. He looked at Whitmore first, then at the dog, then at Emily, and in that order Emily understood more than he meant to reveal. Mason, Linda said sharply, why are you in archives? He swallowed. Doctor. Whitmore asked me to pull an old intake file. Whitmore's expression did not move, but the air around him seemed to tighten. Emily looked at the drawer behind Mason. It was still open an inch. A cardboard marker stuck up from one section, and on its tab, written in faded black ink, she caught 3 letters before Mason shifted his body to block it. Har, her pulse kicked once. What file? Emily asked. Mason's grip tightened on the folders. I don't know. I was just told to pull anything connected to an old military transfer. Whitmore stepped forward. This is internal hospital documentation. Nurse Carter, return to your assigned bay. Ranger moved one paw ahead. The small movement stopped Whitmore more effectively than a shout would have. The dog did not threaten him. He simply entered the space between the doctor and Mason, his wounded body controlled, his attention absolute. Emily looked past Ranger. Was the name Harlan? Mason's face lost color. Linda's voice rose. Emily enough, but the question had already entered the hallway, and no one could pull it back. It sat there with the dust and the fluorescent hum and the faint smell of old cardboard. The name no one wanted spoken. Mason looked at Whitmore. That was his mistake. Emily saw the fear in it. Whitmore's tone sharpened. Give me the files. Before Mason could move, Ranger's head snapped toward the folder stack. He stepped closer, sniffed once, and then fixed on the bottom folder, the one Mason was trying hardest to keep covered. The tab showed only part of a label, but Emily saw enough. Harlan, Ethan. Below it, in smaller type, an old hospital intake number had been stamped across the corner. A red sticker marked the file as inactive. A second sticker, newer and brighter, read restricted access. Emily felt the hallway narrow around her. Ethan Harlan, she said, and the full name sounded almost forbidden once it left her mouth. From the direction of Trauma Room 3, Caleb's monitor alarmed again. The sound came thinly through the corridor, but Ranger reacted as if a hand had pulled him backward. His ears turned toward the ER, his body torn between the file and the man who needed him. Emily understood the choice he was refusing to make. Go to him, she whispered. Ranger did not move until Caleb's voice, weak and distant, carried from the trauma bay through the open hallway. Ranger. The dog turned and moved back toward the ER with a limp that made Emily's chest hurt. He did not run wild. He went with purpose, returning to Caleb because that was still his first duty. Emily watched him disappear around the corner, then turned back to Mason and the file. Whitmore reached for the folder. Emily stepped forward first. This may relate to an unidentified patient currently under our care. It relates to nothing you are qualified to interpret, Whitmore said. I don't need to interpret it to preserve it. Linda made a small sound of disbelief. You are going to get yourself fired over an old folder and a dog. Emily looked at her, and for the first time since starting at Mercy Ridge, she did not feel smaller under Linda's anger. She felt tired of how easily people called caution weakness when it came from someone without power. Mason lowered the folders slightly. There's a digital flag too, he said. Whitmore turned on him. Mason. The clerk flinched, but the words had already begun spilling out. When I pulled the name, the system showed a locked military medical intake from 12 years ago. Harlan Ethan. Caleb Ward was cross-referenced. But the link is broken. It says the record was made inactive after a correction request. Emily's mind caught on the last phrase. Who requested the correction? Mason glanced at the computer terminal inside the room. I didn't open that screen all the way. Whitmore's voice became dangerously calm. You are done here. Emily knew calm like that. She had heard it from doctors who were about to blame nurses for delays they had caused, from supervisors who wanted paperwork to look cleaner than the truth, from people who had learned that quiet threats worked better than loud ones. The hallway was full of witnesses now, but not all witnesses were brave. She moved to the terminal before anyone stopped her. The screen was still awake. Mason had not logged out. A search field showed the name Harlan Ethan. Beneath it, a restricted entry blinked in gray. Not opened, but visible enough to read the summary line. Military transfer intake, Ward Harlan, status. Inactive, access limited by administrative review. Beside the entry was a date from 12 years earlier. Emily's eyes moved to the access history. The most recent access was from last night at 11:42 p.m. Authorized user, M. Whitmore. Her breath caught, but she did not speak immediately. She needed the room to see it before Whitmore explained it away. Mason saw it. One guard saw it. Linda saw it too, though her face fought hard not to admit what her eyes had taken in. Whitmore stepped close enough that Emily could smell the sharp antiseptic on his coat. Print nothing. Touch nothing. Log out. Emily kept her hands away from the keyboard. Why were you in this record last night? For hospital business. Before Caleb Ward arrived, Whitmore's jaw tightened. You are making connections that do not exist. Behind them, Ranger barked once from the ER. It was not a frantic bark. It was short, controlled, urgent. Emily turned and saw the K-9 standing at the end of the hallway beside Caleb's moving stretcher. 2 staff members were preparing to transfer him out of Trauma Room 3. Caleb's face was gray with fever, his eyes locked not on the doors ahead, but on Emily. He raised one shaking hand as far as the restraint allowed and pointed toward the records room. Then his voice broke through the hallway. Page 3, he called. They took page 3. Mason looked down at the folder in his arms. The bottom edge of Ethan Harlan's file showed a torn paper stub still clinging to the binder rings, exactly where a page had once been removed. The torn paper stub in Ethan Harlan's file looked too small to carry 12 years of damage. It clung to the binder rings in 3 ragged strips, pale at the edges where a page had been pulled free long ago or removed in a hurry. Emily stared at it while Caleb's words still echoed from the hallway. Page 3. They took page 3. The staff around her seemed to understand, only that something had become uncomfortable, but Emily felt the deeper wrongness of it spreading outward. A missing page was not a symptom. It was not confusion. It was not a veteran losing touch with the present. It was a place where the truth should have been and was not. Mason held the folder as if it might burn his hands. There are only 2 pages in the intake copy, he said, his voice thinner than before. The index says 3, Doctor. Whitmore reached for the file again, but the security guard who had seen the access history shifted slightly into his path. It was not a challenge, not yet, but it was the first time anyone in that hallway had failed to move exactly as Whitmore expected. Linda noticed, and so did Emily. Authority could bend a room quickly, but evidence slowed it down. We need to return to patient care, Whitmore said. This old paperwork has no bearing on Mr. Ward's current condition. Emily looked past him toward Caleb's stretcher. Ranger stood beside it with his body angled between Caleb and the transport team, not blocking them fully but making every person reconsider the distance between their hands and the patient. Caleb's color had worsened. His breath came shallow, and the muscles in his neck worked with each inhale. Nobody had moved him yet because nobody wanted to be the first to test the dog. His current condition includes panic triggered by being moved away from the one thing keeping him oriented, Emily said. Linda turned on her. You are still not the physician. I am the nurse watching his vitals rise every time we ignore what he says. That earned a sharp silence. Emily had not raised her voice, but she had said it clearly enough for the nearby resident to glance at the monitor and then away. Caleb's heart rate was still high. His oxygen saturation dipped, recovered, then dipped again. Ranger looked from the monitor to Caleb's face, and his ears pulled back with a contained anxiety that looked almost human in its discipline. Whitmore exhaled through his nose. Bring him back to Trauma 3. We will stabilize him, then proceed with evaluation. It sounded like compromise, but Emily heard the trap inside it. Stabilize, then transfer. Calm him, then file him away. The story would remain unchanged, only neater in the chart. As they wheeled Caleb back, Emily kept Ethan Harlan's folder in sight until Mason sealed it in a temporary evidence sleeve at her request. Linda objected to the word evidence again. Emily did not answer her. Instead, she returned to the nurse's station and opened Caleb's active chart, searching for something she could prove without arguing over the past. The current notes were already filling with language that felt too familiar. Patient claims military service without verification. Patient displays paranoid fixation on deceased service member. Patient exhibits combat-related delusional statements. Patient refuses sedation due to irrational fear of harm. Animal presence appears to reinforce agitation. Emily read the lines twice, and with each pass her unease sharpened. They were not observations so much as conclusions wearing hospital language. The chart did not say Caleb's pulse dropped when Ranger stood near him. It did not say he answered to his name, recognized a dog tag, followed questions, or identified a missing page confirmed by an index. It did not say he showed fear only when separated from Ranger or when sedation was forced without explanation. The chart had made up its mind. She clicked into older encounters under Caleb Ward's name. Most were locked behind behavioral flags, but summaries remained visible. Different dates, different facilities, similar wording, unreliable historian, fixation on military incident, claims Marine named Harlan was falsely accused, becomes distressed when challenged, refuses psychiatric transfer, recommended controlled evaluation. The phrases repeated with only minor changes, like someone had copied the first judgment and let it follow him for years. Emily felt a cold anger rise behind her ribs. This was how a person's disappeared while still standing in front of people, not by being erased all at once, but by being described the same wrong way until every new stranger believed the description before the man. A soft sound came from Caleb's room. Not a shout, not even a word. Ranger had moved closer to the bed, his front paws exactly at the line where the floor changed color beneath the trauma. Baylights. Caleb's eyes were open, but his focus had gone distant again, his breath hitched in uneven intervals. Emily stepped in before Linda could stop her. "He's trending down," she said, checking the monitor. "His breathing is getting worse." The resident frowned at the screen. "Saturation is 92. It was 97 when Ranger was allowed closer and no one was preparing." "Transport," Linda followed her in. "That is not a clinical argument. It is a pattern." Ranger suddenly placed one paw on the metal rail of the bed. Not climbing, not begging, but signaling. His nose hovered near Caleb's hand. Emily saw that Caleb's fingers were curled too tightly, his knuckles pale. She loosened the restraint by one notch, enough to relieve pressure without freeing him completely. Linda made an outraged sound, but Caleb's breathing eased almost immediately when his fingertips brushed Ranger's fur. The monitor steadied by 4 beats. Emily did not look at Linda. She looked at the numbers and let them speak. Caleb's voice came after several breaths, rough but clearer than before. "They wrote it before I woke up." Emily leaned closer. "Wrote what?" "The story." His eyes shifted toward the charting computer outside the glass. "Harlan ran, Ward broke, dog got blamed. Easy story." Ranger's ears lifted at Harlan's name. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat moving against dry skin. "It wasn't easy when it happened." Dr. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, and Caleb stopped speaking as if someone had closed a hand around his lungs. Ranger felt the change and turned his head slowly toward the doctor. Once again, he did not snarl, he measured. Emily kept her voice low. "Mr. Ward, did you come here because of the file?" Caleb's eyes flickered. "I came because Ranger found the smell again." Linda folded her arms. "This is exactly the kind of statement that concerns us." Emily ignored the judgment in her tone. "What smell?" Caleb looked at Ranger, then toward the hallway beyond the trauma bay. "Old blood, wet concrete, burned plastic. Same as the night they brought us here." Emily felt the room tilt slightly beneath the weight of that. "You were treated here after the incident?" Caleb nodded once, barely. "Not in this old wing. Back when military transfers came through after the storm closed the VA route, they put us wherever there was space." Whitmore interrupted. "That old wing has been renovated twice. These memories are not reliable." Caleb's face tightened. "You told me that then, too." The words struck so directly that even Linda looked at Whitmore. The doctor's expression remained controlled, but Emily saw color rise along his neck. He had been younger 12 years ago. Perhaps not yet the senior physician who could silence a hallway with one order, but Caleb recognized him. Not as a stranger. Not as a name on an access log. As a man who had stood in the room when the first story was written. Emily asked the next question before fear could stop her. "What did page 3 say?" Caleb's eyes filled, though no tears fell. "It said Harlan held the door from the inside. It said I carried 2 men out because he made me leave. It said the last K9 would not abandon him." Ranger gave a soft, strained whine. Emily looked at him. "The last K9?" Caleb's hand tightened in the dog's fur. "Not Ranger. Before him. Same line. Same training. Same command." Whitmore stepped fully into the room. "This interview is over." "It was not an interview," Emily said. "It was patient care. It was indulgence." Ranger's body stiffened, but Caleb whispered something too low for anyone else to hear. The dog settled again, barely, his obedience fighting his instinct. Emily stepped back to the computer and opened the oldest visible summary one more time. Buried beneath the behavioral flags was a scanned intake note from 12 years earlier, mostly blanked by access limits. One line remained visible because it had been typed into the wrong field. Patient arrived with military working dog. Animal refused removal from ward. Responded to command phrase. Handler name redacted. Emily stared at the line. Ranger was not the first dog to guard Caleb Ward in this hospital. The pattern had started years before, and someone had stripped the names from it until only the judgment remained. Behind her, Ranger suddenly lifted his head and turned toward the far end of the ear, away from archives now, away from the ambulance bay. His nose worked the air. His body changed before anyone else noticed anything, tension drawing through him like a wire. Then he stepped away from Caleb's bed, looked back once to make sure Emily was watching, and moved toward a dark service corridor marked storage and closed treatment rooms. Caleb's eyes followed him. "That's where they put us," he whispered. "That's where Harlan's blood was still on the floor." Emily looked at the corridor, then at the dog tag sealed in her pocket, and understood that Ranger was no longer asking her to read what had been written. He was asking her to see what had been left behind. Ranger moved toward the service corridor with the certainty of an animal, following a trail no one else could smell. Emily followed before anyone gave her permission. She heard Linda call her name, heard Dr. Whitmore tell security to stop the dog, heard the wheels of Caleb's bed squeak as the resident tried to keep the veteran from rising against the restraint. None of it slowed Ranger. His limp was worse now, but his direction never wavered. He passed the supply carts, the locked utility closet, the laundry bins waiting under fluorescent lights, and stopped in front of a wide gray door marked storage and closed treatment rooms. The hallway beyond the main ER felt colder. It belonged to an older part of Mercy Ridge, the kind of place hospitals kept after renovation because no one had decided whether to repair it, repurpose it, or pretend it was not there. The ceiling tiles were stained from old leaks. The floor changed from polished white to a dull, speckled vinyl that had been scrubbed too many times. A faint smell of bleach floated above something older underneath it, something metallic and damp that made Ranger's nose work harder. He lowered his head to the bottom of the door. Emily stopped a few feet behind him. She did not reach for his collar. She did not speak his name as if he were a pet. Ranger was working, and every inch of him showed it. His ears shifted toward the room. His injured paw lifted, then pressed carefully against the seam where the door met the floor. He scratched once, slow and controlled, then turned his head toward Emily. Not a request for comfort, a request to open it. Linda reached the corridor behind her, breath tight with anger. "This area is closed for a reason." "What reason?" Emily asked. "Storage overflow, old plumbing, infection control." "Pick one." Dr. Whitmore came up beside them, his face arranged into professional impatience. "Nurse Carter, you will return to your station now." Emily looked down at Ranger's bloody paw print, then at the old door. "Caleb said this is where they put them. He is not a reliable historian. His dog is tracking something in a closed corridor that matches his memory. That is not medicine." Emily turned enough to meet his eyes. Neither is ignoring a patient because his history embarrasses someone. The words were out before she could soften them. Linda inhaled sharply. One of the guards shifted his stance. Dr. Whitmore's expression did not break, but his silence sharpened around her. From the ER behind them, Caleb's voice carried weakly. "Treatment 7. Ranger's ears lifted. Emily looked at the gray door again. The current sign said storage. But beneath the plastic label, half peeled by age, another sign remained. Faded blue letters showed through the torn adhesive. Treatment 7 Mason. The records clerk had followed at a cautious distance with Ethan Harlan's folder sealed under his arm. His face went pale when he saw the old label. "That room still has a manual key," he said. "Maintenance keeps it at the charge desk." Linda spun toward him. "Mason, stop helping." He lowered his eyes but did not step back. "The access log won't show a manual entry." That mattered. Emily saw the realization pass through the guard's face. If the room held nothing, opening it should not frighten anyone. If the room held something, a manual lock meant years of quiet access without a digital trail. Dr. Whitmore said, "No one opens that door without facilities." Ranger scratched once more, then lay down directly in front of it. The movement silenced the argument more effectively than shouting would have. He placed his body across the threshold exactly as he had done outside Caleb's room, but this time he faced outward, protecting the closed door from the people behind him. His wound had begun to drip again. Blood spotted the floor beneath his ear. He was in pain, yet he chose the door. Emily looked at Linda. "If you want to remove him, You'll have to explain why no one checked what an injured working K9 is guarding. Linda's mouth tightened. She hated being cornered by liability more than she hated being challenged. After an off moment, she sent the guard for the key. The wait felt longer than it was. Caleb remained in sight at the far end of the corridor. His bed held just outside the main ear because Ranger would not go farther and Caleb would not stop watching him. A nurse adjusted his oxygen. The resident hovered near the monitor, finally looking less certain than before. Caleb's hand kept flexing against the restraint, not fighting it now, but remembering something his body had never forgotten. When the guard returned with the key, Dr. Whitmore moved as if to take it. Emily noticed Ranger's eyes follow the doctor's hand. The guard noticed too and gave the key to Linda instead. Linda unlocked the door with visible reluctance. The hinges resisted, then gave with a dry scrape. Cold, stale air slipped into the corridor. The room beyond was not empty. It was packed with discarded hospital equipment, folded privacy screens, cracked IV poles, boxes of outdated paper forms, and a broken exam table shoved against the far wall. Dust lay over most surfaces, but not evenly. A narrow path crossed the floor from the door to a tall metal cabinet in the back corner. The path had been disturbed more recently than the rest of the room. Ranger rose and entered first. Emily followed slowly, eyes adjusting to the weak light that flickered awake overhead. The smell was stronger inside. Bleach, dust, old water damage, and beneath it the unmistakable iron trace of blood so old it should have been gone. Ranger went straight to the back cabinet and stopped. He did not sniff around randomly. He put his nose to the lower hinge, then lowered his body until his chest touched the floor. Beside the cabinet, the vinyl showed deep scratches. Emily crouched. The marks ran in clusters, 4 parallel lines at a time, dragged backward across the floor. Not new. The edges were dark with grime and age, but the shape was too distinct to ignore. She had seen fresh claw marks in kennel rooms when frightened dogs tried to brace against being pulled. These were larger, deeper, made by an animal that had fought to stay near something or someone. Ranger placed his injured paw beside one set of old marks. The size matched. Not exactly, Emily realized. Ranger was too young to have made them 12 years ago. But the spacing was almost identical, the stance familiar. The kind of mark left by the same breed, the same training line, the same refusal to abandon a command. Caleb's voice came from the hallway, broken by distance. He wouldn't leave Harlan. Emily looked back toward him. Caleb had lifted his head as far as he could. His eyes were fixed on the cabinet, and his face held the terrible recognition of a man watching a memory become physical. Linda entered behind Emily, covering her unease with irritation. Old scratches in an abandoned room do not prove anything. No, Emily said, keeping her voice steady. But they tell us where to look. Ranger pressed his muzzle against the bottom of the cabinet. The metal doors were chained shut with a small padlock that looked newer than everything around it. That detail made the room colder. Old rooms collected old locks. New locks were choices. Mason stepped closer and read the faded inventory sticker. This cabinet was supposed to be emptied before renovation. When, Emily asked? Years ago, he said. Before I worked here, Doctor. Whitmore stayed at the doorway. This is now a facilities issue. Emily did not look at him. Then call facilities. No one moved. The guard who had brought the key finally took a small bolt cutter from his belt pouch, the kind used for broken locker seals and equipment locks. He looked at Linda for approval. Linda hesitated long enough for everyone to understand she did not want the cabinet opened. Then she nodded once. The lock snapped. Ranger rose but did not crowd the cabinet. He backed half a step, giving Emily room. That, more than anything, made her hands feel unsteady. He knew this was for her to see. Inside the cabinet were old linens sealed in yellowing plastic, a cracked basin, 2 empty oxygen masks, and a stack of outdated transfer forms warped by moisture. At first, it looked like nothing worth hiding. Then Ranger pushed his nose toward the bottom shelf and gave a low, contained whine. Emily moved the linens aside. Behind them, taped flat against the back panel of the cabinet, was a piece of dark green fabric wrapped around something hard. The tape had browned with age. The fabric was stiff at the edges, stained in patches that no amount of years could make harmless. She peeled it loose carefully, every person in the room watching her hands. It was a torn strip from a military uniform. Along one edge, written in faded marker, were 3 names. Ward, Harlan, Extraction Team. Beneath the fabric, caught in its fold, was a small black patch with a K9 insignia and a unit number partly burned. Away, Ranger lowered his head until his nose nearly touched the cloth, then lay down beside it as if guarding a fallen handler. Emily felt the room change again. The missing page had been paper, the dog tag had been metal. This was different. This was blood, cloth, and a link between Caleb, Harlan, and a K9 unit that someone had hidden behind a locked cabinet in a closed treatment room. Caleb began to shake in the hallway, not from confusion, from recognition. Dr. Whitmore finally stepped into the room, his voice tight. "Bag it and give it to me." Ranger's growl filled the storage room before Emily could answer. The dog did not move from the cloth. His body covered the evidence with painful, perfect discipline. Emily looked at the old scratches on the floor, the new lock on the cabinet, the names on the fabric, and the doctor reaching for what had been hidden. Then she saw one more thing beneath the torn uniform strip. A faded hospital label stuck to the back of the cloth bore a room number, a date from 12 years ago, and initials printed in black ink, MW. The initials MW sat on the faded hospital label like a signature someone had forgotten to erase. Emily held the torn strip of military fabric under the weak storage room light, careful not to let her gloved fingers cover the date or the room number. The label had been stuck to the back of the cloth 12 years earlier, when Treatment 7 was still a treatment room instead of a forgotten storage space. Time had yellowed the adhesive and curled one corner, but the black letters remained clear enough for everyone to read. MW, the same initials as Dr. Marcus Whitmore. For several seconds, nobody spoke over the soft hum of the old ceiling fixture. Ranger remained low beside the evidence. His sable body stretched across the floor between the cloth and Dr. Whitmore. The canine's breathing was uneven from pain, but his discipline did not break. His nose hovered near the fabric as if he were guarding a wounded handler rather than a piece of cloth. In the hallway, Caleb Ward shook under a thin blanket, his eyes locked on the object Emily had uncovered. The veteran looked less like a confused patient now and more like a man watching a grave open. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, palm out. "That item is hospital property." Emily kept the cloth where it was. "It has military names on it, old blood, a K9 unit patch, and a hospital label connected to this room. It needs to be sealed. It needs to be handled by someone authorized. Then call someone authorized outside this hospital." Linda Marsh gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "Listen to yourself. You are a rookie nurse accusing a senior physician because a dog led you to a rag in a storage room." Emily felt the insult, but it did not land the way it would have an hour earlier. Linda could still threaten her job. Whitmore could still make her look reckless on paper. But the cloth was real, the dog tag was real, the missing page was real. Caleb's command had been real enough to drop Ranger into perfect position in front of half the ER. The evidence was beginning to stand where Emily had stood alone. Mason shifted near the doorway with Ethan Harlan's sealed folder clutched against his chest. "The label format is old," he said quietly. "We stopped using those room labels after the renovation." Linda turned on him. "Mason, do not insert yourself." He swallowed, but his eyes stayed on the cloth. "The date matches the old intake file." Whitmore's face changed by almost nothing, yet Emily saw the calculation behind his eyes. The room had too many witnesses now, too many objects, too many small confirmations. Authority could still control the story, but only if the story moved quickly somewhere private. The overhead pager crackled from the main ER, followed by a voice asking for security to report to ambulance intake. Another set of footsteps approached from the corridor. Two uniformed animal control officers appeared with a rigid leash, a muzzle, and the tired caution of people expecting the worst. Ranger lifted his head. Caleb tried to rise from the stretcher. "Don't take him." His voice broke halfway through the sentence, and the monitor beside him answered with a rapid alarm. Emily moved at once, passing Linda and Whitmore to reach Caleb's side. His skin felt cold beneath her fingers. His pulse was fast and thin. He was not acting out. His body was running from a threat it recognized before his words could explain it. "He needs the dog near him," Emily said. Whitmore followed her into the hallway. "He needs psychiatric containment and medical stabilization without an animal interfering. He destabilizes every time you try to separate them. He destabilizes because this situation keeps being indulged." Emily adjusted Caleb's oxygen and watched Ranger step out of the storage room with painful care. The canine did not rush the animal control officers. He did not hide behind Emily. He moved to Caleb's stretcher and stood with his shoulder near the veteran's hand, close enough for Caleb's fingers to touch fur. Within seconds, the monitor slowed by a few beats. The resident noticed. Emily saw him notice. Linda did too, and that made her angrier. "We are transferring Mr. Ward to the behavioral health wing once he is cleared," Linda said. "The dog will not go with him." Caleb's fingers dug into Ranger's coat. "He stays." Ranger pressed closer but not onto the bed. Even exhausted, even hurt, he understood lines better than the people arguing over him. He gave Caleb contact without crowding the equipment, comfort without breaking control. Emily looked toward the animal control officers. He is injured and trained. He needs veterinary care, not force. One officer lowered his eyes to Ranger's tactical collar and hesitated. Is he a military working dog? Whitmore answered before Emily could. He is an unknown animal involved in an attack on a physician. Ranger's ears flicked toward the word attack, but his body stayed still. Emily stepped beside him. He prevented an injection during a moment when the patient was trying to communicate. He has not bitten anyone. Linda pointed down the hall. You are done speaking for that dog. The words struck harder than they should have. Not because Emily was surprised, but because Linda had finally said aloud what had been true all night. They were not only trying to silence Caleb, they were trying to silence Ranger too, to turn purposeful behavior into animal aggression and a veteran's memory into mental instability. Once those labels were entered cleanly, everyone could stop looking at the evidence. Whitmore looked at the guards. Move the dog. Ranger moved first. He stepped away from Caleb, crossed directly in front of Emily, and placed himself between the stretcher and the animal control officers. His head remained level, his mouth closed, his stance balanced despite the injured paw. It was not a challenge, it was a boundary. The younger officer stopped. I don't want to force this dog if he's trained. Whitmore's voice sharpened. You were called to remove him. Emily used the hesitation. She turned to Mason. Can you access hallway camera footage? Mason blinked at her. Not directly, security can. The guard who had seen the archive access log looked uncomfortable. Camera review requires supervisor approval. Linda stepped in. Absolutely not. Emily held up the sealed evidence sleeve with the fabric inside. Then document that the hospital refused camera review after physical evidence was found in a locked room tied to the current patient. The hallway seemed to contract around that sentence. Nobody liked documentation when it pointed the wrong direction. The guard looked at Linda, then at Whitmore, then at the animal control officers, who had paused long enough to become witnesses without meaning to. I can pull hallway footage from last night, the guard said carefully. Only the corridor, not inside archives. Whitmore turned toward him. That is unnecessary. The guard did not lower his eyes this time. It may clarify who accessed the area. Emily saw the shift, small but real. The first crack had not come from courage alone. It had come from risk spreading beyond Emily. If the hospital buried this now, everyone present would have to decide how much silence they were willing to own. They moved to the security alcove near the ambulance entrance, not as a united group, but as people pulled by the same dangerous question. Caleb remained on the stretcher just outside, Ranger standing close enough for the veteran's hand to rest against his shoulder. Emily stayed where Caleb could see her. She still had the dog tag secured in the patient property envelope inside her scrub pocket, beneath the sealed sleeve containing the fabric. When Linda reached once as if to take the envelope, Emily shifted away and logged both items under Caleb's temporary chart number on the portable scanner. Linda's voice dropped. You are committing insubordination in real time. Emily kept scanning. I am preserving patient property in real time. The security guard pulled up footage from the previous night. Grainy black and white images filled the screen. The archive's hallway appeared empty at first, lit by the same flickering overhead panel. The timestamp in the corner moved toward 11:42 p.m. A figure entered the frame. White coat, badge access, measured steps, Dr. Whitmore. He stood at the archive's door, looked once over his shoulder and used his badge. The door opened. He disappeared inside and remained there long enough for the timestamp to advance almost 6 minutes. When he came out, he carried a folder under his arm and something smaller runnels in his left hand, something he slipped into his coat pocket before walking out of frame. No one in the alcove spoke. Emily felt Caleb's hand tighten in Ranger's fur behind her. The K9 leaned into him without taking his eyes off Whitmore. Linda's face had gone pale. Whitmore stared at the screen, then said with careful control, I reviewed legacy records for administrative purposes. Emily looked at the frozen image of his hand sliding something into his pocket before the patient arrived. Whitmore turned toward her slowly. You are suspended from patient care effective immediately. The sentence should have frightened her more than it did. Maybe it would later. In that moment, Emily could only hear Caleb's ragged breathing and Ranger's low warning as two guards stepped toward her. Then the security screen refreshed to the next camera angle. This one showed the old service corridor outside Treatment 7. At 11:58 p.m., Whitmore entered the storage room with a key. When he came out, the file under his arm was gone, and his left hand was empty. Ranger gave one sharp bark that made everyone flinch. Emily looked from the screen to the storage hallway. then to the doctor who had just tried to remove the patient, the dog, and the nurse in the same order. For the first time, she understood that this was not a misunderstanding Mercy Ridge had inherited. Someone inside the hospital had been maintaining the lie. The frozen image on the security monitor did more than accuse Dr. Whitmore. It changed the way everyone stood around him. Emily saw it first in the guard, who had pulled the footage. His hand remained on the mouse, but his eyes no longer moved to Whitmore for permission. Mason stood near the wall with Ethan Harlan's sealed file pressed against his chest, his nervousness turning into something steadier. Even Linda Marsh, who had spent the night treating Emily like a problem to control, stared at the screen as if the hallway under her feet had shifted by an inch. Whitmore had entered archives before Caleb arrived. He had gone into Treatment 7 before anyone knew Ranger would lead them there. He had left one room with a file and the other without it. That did not prove everything, but it proved enough to make silence feel dangerous. "You are suspended from patient care," Whitmore repeated. His voice low now, meant to sound final. Emily looked at Caleb's stretcher beyond the alcove. Ranger stood beside it, body angled toward the doctor, ears forward, wounded paw barely touching the floor. Caleb watched Emily with a face drained of strength and full of fear, not fear for himself alone, but fear that the room would still choose the easier story. Emily slipped the sealed evidence sleeve and patient property envelope deeper into the front pocket of her scrub jacket, then assigned another nurse to monitor his vitals while this is documented. Linda's mouth tightened. "You do not get to give instructions. I am asking for safe coverage for a patient." The resident, who had said almost nothing since the footage appeared, stepped toward Caleb's monitor. "I can stay with him." Whitmore turned sharply. "You will follow the transfer order." The resident looked at Caleb, then at Ranger, then back at the screen. "He is not stable for transfer." The words were careful, but they landed like a door closing softly between Whitmore and the rest of the room. Emily did not smile. This was not a victory. Caleb was still strapped to a stretcher, Ranger was still bleeding, and she was still one signature away from losing the only job she had ever wanted. But one person had stopped repeating the wrong story, and sometimes that was how truth began. Mason took a hesitant step toward Emily. "There is something else in the restricted summary." Whitmore's eyes cut to him. "Do not." Mason's throat moved, but he continued. "The Harlan file references an external news clipping. It was scanned into the old system because families used to bring articles with transfer records. The title is visible even though the document is locked." Emily turned to him. "What does it say?" Mason looked down at the folder as if he hated the words before speaking them. "Recon Marine blamed after failed extraction." Caleb closed his eyes. The effect on him was immediate and terrible. His face folded inward, not with surprise, but with the exhaustion of hearing an old wound named in public again. Ranger pressed his shoulder beneath Caleb's hand, and the veteran's fingers sank weakly into the dog's coat. Linda's voice softened despite herself. "Blamed for what?" Mason opened the old file just enough to read from the visible index page without breaking the seal on restricted contents. It says there was a storm evacuation, a military convoy accident, and a temporary treatment site at Mercy Ridge. Ethan Harlan was listed as having abandoned a rear exit during extraction. Caleb Ward was listed as the only surviving witness, but his statement was considered unreliable due to head trauma. Caleb's eyes opened, glassy but fierce. "They printed it before I could stand." Emily moved closer, stopping at the line Whitmore had drawn by suspending her from care. She kept her hands away from Caleb's equipment, but her voice stayed with him. "Who printed it?" "The base paper first," Caleb whispered, "then local news." Then every man who wanted a clean ending repeated it. Whitmore exhaled sharply. "This is not relevant to acute treatment." Ranger's head turned toward him with such controlled focus that the animal control officers took a step back without being asked. Emily noticed the younger officer lower the rigid leash to his side. Ranger had not given them one reason to believe he was a stray threat. He had given them reason after reason to believe he was still on duty. Mason continued, quieter now. "The article says Harlan left his team." Caleb's hand tightened in Ranger's fur. Harlan held the door. The phrase changed Ranger's breathing. The K-9's injured body went still, and Emily saw the command memory pass through him again, not as a trick, but as training inherited through repetition, scent, and human grief. Caleb looked down at the dog and seemed to understand that Ranger needed the truth spoken as much as he did. "It was raining so hard the lights kept dying," Caleb said. "They put us in treatment 7 because the main bay was full." Harlan was bleeding from the side, but he kept standing. "We had 2 wounded men, 1 medic down, and a working dog that would not leave the exit because something was wrong with the door. Emily could feel the room listening despite itself. The ER beyond the alcove still moved around them, but more slowly now, as if the hospital had lowered its voice for a confession. Caleb swallowed, fighting for enough air to continue. The back corridor flooded, the lock jammed. Harlan braced it open from inside while I pulled the others through. He gave me his tag because he knew the door was slipping. He said if the report got ugly, names would matter. Emily felt the envelope in her pocket grow heavier. Linda looked toward Treatment 7. Why would anyone say he ran? Caleb's gaze moved to Whitmore. Because someone had to explain why a Marine was left inside a locked room. Whitmore's face hardened. This is fantasy built out of trauma. No, Caleb said, his voice breaking. Fantasy would have let me sleep. The line struck Emily with more force than shouting could have. She had seen patients fight diagnoses before, seen families reject hard truths, seen fear turn people into unreliable narrators of their own bodies. Caleb was not rejecting pain. He was carrying it too precisely. He remembered the door, the rain, the dog, the tag, the report, and the way no one believed him after they wrote the first lie. The guard at the monitor cleared his throat. The old news clipping may be in public archives. Whitmore turned slowly toward him. You are security, not legal counsel. The guard did not look away. I am also seeing a pattern that needs escalation. Emily understood then that the room had crossed a line Whitmore could not easily pull back. The truth was still incomplete, but it had witnesses now. Not heroes, not investigators, ordinary people who had seen enough to become uncomfortable with obedience. Mason moved to a second terminal and typed with shaking hands. He did not open restricted medical records. He searched public news archives, the kind of database the hospital used for media inquiries and old community reports. After a few seconds, scanned newspaper page appeared on the screen, grainy and gray. The headline was exactly what Mason had read. Beneath it was a photograph of 3 uniformed men outside a transport vehicle, taken before everything went wrong. Ethan Harlan stood on the left, younger than Emily had imagined, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, one hand resting on the harness of a German shepherd. Caleb Ward stood beside him, thinner then, eyes narrowed against the sun. Between them was a third man whose face had been partly blurred by the poor scan, but the caption beneath remained clear. Commander Joseph Hale, pictured with Recon Marines Ethan Harlan and Caleb Ward before storm extraction. Mission. Emily leaned closer. Commander Joseph Hale. The name felt like a door opening somewhere beyond the hospital. A commander meant an outside witness. Someone with rank, someone who might know whether Harlan had been called a coward because he failed or because someone needed him voiceless. Emily read the article summary beside the photo. It claimed Harlan abandoned his position during a chaotic evacuation. It claimed Ward's later objections were attributed to injury-related confusion. It claimed the matter had been reviewed and closed. Closed. The word made Emily think of locked cabinets, missing pages, and old rooms renamed as storage. Caleb stared at the photo on the screen. His face changed when he saw Harlan alive in the grainy image. He looked younger for a moment and more broken because of it. Ranger lifted his muzzle toward the screen, then back to Caleb, responding not to the photograph itself but to the scent of grief rising from the man beside him. That dog in the picture, Emily said carefully. Was he the one from that night? Caleb nodded. Atlas, Harlan's K9. He stayed at the door until they dragged him off. Ranger gave a low, aching whine. The sound settled over the group with unexpected weight. Ranger had not known Atlas as a memory, not the way Caleb had. Yet something in his training, his line, or his handler's history carried the shape of that command. Hold the line. Guard the door. Do not abandon the man inside. Whitmore stepped toward the terminal. Turn that off. Mason did not move fast enough for him. Emily reached for a blank incident form from the security desk and wrote Commander Joseph Hale's name before anyone could make the screen disappear. She added the article date, the mission reference, and the caption exactly as it appeared. Her handwriting was not elegant, but it was legible. After tonight, legible might matter more than anything. Linda watched her write. You understand suspension means you should leave the clinical area. Emily capped the pen. I understand Caleb Ward should not be moved until someone outside this hospital reviews the evidence. Whitmore's voice was nearly flat. You will not contact anyone. Caleb lifted his head with effort. Hale knew the command. Emily looked at him. Commander Hale? He trained the extraction team before the storm. Caleb's eyes moved toward Ranger. If he hears the dog respond, he'll know I didn't make it up. Ranger stood then, slow and painful, and faced the ambulance entrance. His ears lifted toward the sound of rain still striking the glass doors outside, and his body settled into that same disciplined readiness Emily had seen at the trauma room, the records door, and treatment 7. He was waiting for the next witness. Emily folded the incident form and slipped it beside the evidence envelope. The hospital had believed one story for 12 years because it was clean, convenient, and signed by the right people. Now a wounded veteran, a rookie nurse, and a bleeding K9 had found the name of the man who might finally break it open. At the far end of the ER, the automatic doors parted for a police officer coming in from the rain. Ranger did not look at the officer. He kept staring past him, toward the dark parking lot, as if someone else was still on the way. Ranger kept staring past the police officer, past the ambulance lights, past the sliding glass doors washed silver by rain. Emily followed his line of sight and saw only the parking lot at first. The storm had thinned to a hard drizzle, turning every street lamp into a blurred yellow circle on the wet pavement. Cars sat in uneven rows beyond the ambulance lane. A police cruiser idled near the curb, its roof lights cutting red and blue across the glass. The officer who had entered looked confused by the dog's attention, then uneasy when Ranger did not even glance at him. The K9 was waiting for someone else. Behind Emily, Dr. Whitmore was already trying to regain the room. He told the police officer there had been an animal incident, a disruptive nurse, and an unstable veteran interfering with medical care. He used clean words, controlled words, words meant to make the night smaller than it was. The officer listened, but his eyes kept moving to the injured German shepherd standing beside Caleb's stretcher with battlefield stillness. Emily held the folded incident form in her pocket beside the sealed dog tag and the fabric from treatment 7. Commander Joseph Hale's name sat in her mind like a flare. She had no phone number for him, no authority to summon him, and no certainty that he was alive, local, or willing to step into a hospital argument at midnight. Then Mason, still at the security terminal, whispered that the old article listed Hale as retired in the county 2 towns over. Linda heard him and snapped, "Do not search personal information." Mason looked at Emily instead of Linda. "There's a veterans ouch directed ready connected to the hospital. His name might be in it because he spoke here on Memorial Day 3 years ago." Dr. Whitmore turned sharply. "No one is contacting anyone." That command finally pushed the police officer out of passive listening. "Doctor, if there's evidence related to a prior military incident and a current patient is asking for a witness, I need to understand what I walked into." Whitmore's face tightened. "You walked into a hospital matter." Emily spoke before fear could catch her. "Officer, there are sealed patient property items and camera footage showing Dr. Whitmore accessed old records before this patient arrived. The patient identified a missing page from a restricted file before anyone showed it to him. The K9 led us to physical evidence in a locked treatment room. The words were not dramatic. That made them stronger." The officer looked from Emily to the security monitor, then to Caleb. The veteran's eyes were half closed, but his hand remained buried in Ranger's coat as if the dog's body were the only solid thing left in the room. "Call Hale," Caleb rasped. Ranger's ears lifted at the name. Mason found the directory entry with trembling hands. Joseph Hale, retired Navy commander. Veterans Recovery Advocate. Emergency contact listed through the county outreach liaison. Emily watched Linda's expression harden when Mason dialed from the hospital phone, but the presence of the police officer made her stop short of grabbing the receiver. The call lasted less than a minute. Mason listened, gave the hospital name, explained only that Caleb Ward was in the ER and had asked for Commander Hale. Then his face changed. "He says he's already here." Ranger moved before the words fully settled. He stepped away from Caleb's stretcher, but only after pressing his shoulder once beneath Caleb's hand, a brief contact that felt almost like a promise. Then he limped toward the ambulance entrance. The animal control officers parted without being told. The police officer turned to look through the glass. An older man stood beyond the doors in a dark raincoat, blocked by a hospital security guard near the curb. He was tall despite the bend age had put in his shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a face cut by discipline rather than softness. He carried no weapon Emily could see, no uniform, no visible rank, but the way he stood in the rain made the night seem to organize itself around him. Ranger stopped inside the doors. The man outside looked through the glass and saw the dog. For a moment his expression did not change. Then his hand rose slowly, not toward the guard, not in greeting, but palm down at his side in a gesture so small Emily might have missed it if Ranger had not responded. The German shepherd sat, not casually, not because he was tired. He sat straight despite the injury, chest lifted, eyes fixed on the man in the rain, waiting. The security guard outside looked baffled. The police officer opened the sliding doors. Cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the smell of asphalt and storm water. Commander Joseph Hale stepped inside without hurry, wiping nothing from his coat. His eyes moved once across the room, cataloging the police officer, Whitmore, Linda, Emily, the animal control officers, the stretcher, Caleb, and finally Ranger. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to force people to listen. Who gave that dog the command? Caleb tried to answer, but his breath caught. Emily stepped closer, careful not to touch him now that she had technically been removed from care. Caleb Ward said the phrase, "hold line." Ranger obeyed. Hale's gaze sharpened. The full phrase is, "hold the line." It was never written into public training material. Ranger's body remained still, but Emily saw the smallest flick of his ears at the corrected words. Whitmore inserted himself quickly. "Commander Hale, this is a medical facility. Mr. Ward is in a distressed state and has been making claims about an old incident." Hale did not look at him. "I heard that same sentence 12 years ago." The room shifted again. Caleb opened his eyes fully. His face broke at the sight of Hale. Not into relief exactly, but into the stunned pain of a man who had waited so long for a witness that he no longer trusted one standing in front of him. "Sir," Caleb whispered. Hale stepped to the stretcher. Ranger rose and moved beside him, not friendly, not submissive, but formal. He sat at Hale's left side, then lowered his head once. The gesture was so precise that even Linda seemed to understand it was not affection. It was recognition of command structure. Hale looked down at the dog's collar. "Ranger." Emily expected him to ask where the dog came from. Instead, Hale closed his eyes for half a second. Atlas was his grandsire. The words made Caleb's hand tremble. Emily felt the missing part of the story move closer. Ranger was not carrying a ghost in some mystical way. He carried training, bloodline, scent memory reinforced by human command, and perhaps years of Caleb repeating a truth no one else believed. The dog knew the old posture because his line had been bred and trained from the same working K9 that had guarded Harlan at the door. Hale turned to Emily. "Show me what you found," Linda began. "She has no authority to," the police officer interrupted. "She can show sealed property in my presence." Emily took out the patient property envelope first. She held it flat so Hale could read without touching it. The commander's face changed when he saw the name. It was not surprise. It was recognition controlled by grief. "Ethan Harlan's tag," Hale said. "That should have gone to his family." Caleb's eyes closed. Emily showed the sealed sleeve containing the fabric next. Hale leaned closer to the names written along the edge and the burned K9 patch tucked in. The fold. Extraction team marker. "We used cloth strips when paper tags got soaked. Ward, Harlan, K9 unit. This is real." Whitmore's voice cut in. "With respect, Commander, old fabric and a distressed man's statements do not establish medical truth." Hale finally looked at him. "No, doctor. They established that someone kept evidence in a locked room for 12 years. No one answered." Hale turned toward the security monitor. Mason replayed the footage at the police officer's request. Whitmore entering archives. Whitmore entering treatment 7, the folder under his arm, the empty hands after he left. Hale watched without moving, but something in him seemed to grow colder with each frame. When the clip ended, he asked, "Where is the file now?" Mason lifted the sealed folder. "Here, but page 3 is missing." Hale's eyes moved to Caleb. "You remembered the page?" Caleb stared at him, humiliated by the question until Hale's voice softened slightly. "I need you to say it for them, Marine." The word Marine changed Caleb's face. The hospital had called him unstable, unidentified, unreliable, and combative. Hale called him by what he had been before the wrong story swallowed him. Caleb drew in a shaking breath. "Page 3, said Harlan, stayed behind. It said he braced the rear exit from inside so I could pull the wounded out. It said Atlas refused to leave the door. It said I was ordered to retreat because the structure was failing." Hale nodded once, slowly. That page existed. Emily felt the confirmation move through the room like a held breath released. Linda looked away. The resident stared at the floor. The younger animal control officer wiped rain from his sleeve, though he had been inside for several minutes. Whitmore's voice remained controlled, but thinner. If such a page existed, it would be in military custody, not a hospital archive. Hale's eyes stayed on him. A copy was sent with the transfer intake because Ward was unconscious, and Harlan was presumed dead at scene review. Mercy Ridge received the medical packet. I requested it later. I was told the hospital copy contained no final statement. Emily looked toward archives. Ranger did too. The dog stood suddenly, pain forgotten under duty. He turned away from Caleb, away from Hale. and faced the records hallway again. His ears came forward, his nose lifted into the air. Then he looked directly at Emily. Hale saw it. He has another scent. Emily's pulse quickened. Archives? Ranger took one limping step in that direction, then stopped and looked back at Caleb. The veteran's hand lifted weakly from the blanket. Go, Caleb whispered. Find him. Ranger did not move until Hale spoke the full command in a voice that seemed to reach back through 12 years of rain, steel, and silence. Ranger, hold the line forward. The K-9 turned and moved toward the old records corridor with Emily, Hale, Mason, the police officer, and half the shaken hallway following behind him. At the locked archives door, Ranger did not scratch the seam this time. He pressed his nose to the lower cabinet built into the wall beside it, the one Emily had walked past twice without noticing. Mason frowned, then reached behind the loose kick plate. His fingers found a hidden latch. A narrow maintenance drawer slid open. Inside lay a sealed envelope marked with a faded military medical stamp. On the front in aging black ink were 3 words that made Caleb begin to cry from the stretcher behind them. Page 3 copy. The envelope rested inside the narrow maintenance drawer, as if it had been waiting 12 years for the right hands to find it. Emily did not reach for it immediately, neither did Commander Hale. The police officer stepped closer and lifted his phone to photograph the drawer before anything moved. For once, no one accused Emily of overreacting. The words on the front were too plain, too deliberate, too impossible to turn into a misunderstanding. Page 3 copy. A faded military medical stamp crossed the corner. The paper had yellowed along the edges, but the seal remained intact beneath a strip of brittle tape. Ranger stood beside the wall cabinet, nose lowered to the drawer, ears forward. His body trembled from exhaustion, yet his focus never broke. He had not scratched at random. He had not followed noise or panic. He had led them past the obvious locked door to a hidden place beneath it, where a copy of the missing page had survived behind a loose kick plate, while the official folder sat incomplete inside archives. Behind them, Caleb made a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than pain. Hale turned toward him. Ward, stay with us. Caleb's eyes were fixed on the envelope. The stretcher had been brought near enough for him to see, but not close enough for him to reach. His hand lay against the blanket, fingers opening and closing, as if the memory of holding Harlan's tag had returned to his palm. Ranger looked back once, and when Caleb gave the smallest nod, the K-9 settled his injured paw near the drawer again. Emily understood the gesture. Guard it until it is witnessed. The police officer pulled on gloves from a wall-mounted emergency box. Commander, I want you and Nurse Carter watching when I remove it. Dr. Whitmore moved in sharply. That document may contain protected medical information. The officer did not take his eyes off the drawer. Then we will preserve it under hospital and law enforcement witness until the proper authority reviews it. Whitmore's voice tightened. This is outside your jurisdiction. Hale answered before the officer could. A military medical transfer record tied to a deceased Marine, a living veteran, and concealed evidence is not yours to bury. The hallway went still around the word bury. Emily felt Caleb hear it. She saw his eyes close briefly, not from weakness alone, but from the unbearable relief of hearing another man finally name what had been done. The officer lifted the envelope from the drawer and placed it on a clean procedure tray Mason had brought from the nurse station. Mason's hand shook as he set the tray on a rolling stand, but he did not step away. Linda stood farther back now, arms folded tightly, her face pale with the look of someone who had followed a superior too long and was beginning to fear where obedience had led her. The tape cracked when the officer opened the seal. Inside was a single folded page, protected in a thin plastic sleeve. The top bore the same intake number as Ethan Harlan's file. In the upper right corner was the page marker that had been missing from the binder. Page 3 of 3. Emily felt her throat tighten. The officer unfolded the sleeve carefully and turned it so Hale could read first. The commander leaned over it, and the discipline in his face almost held. Almost. His jaw shifted once. His hand closed at his side. Read it aloud. Caleb whispered. Hale looked toward him. This will hurt. Caleb's mouth trembled. It already did. The commander nodded, then began in a voice low enough to keep the words from becoming theater, but clear enough for every person in the hallway to hear. The page documented a rear corridor failure during emergency extraction. It named Caleb Ward as the Marine ordered to evacuate 2 wounded personnel through a partially jammed exit. It named Ethan Harlan as the Marine who remained inside the failing doorway to hold the frame open long enough for the others to clear. It stated that Harlan transferred his identification tag to Ward before returning to the threshold. It recorded that the military working dog Atlas refused removal from the doorway until forcibly separated after structural collapse. Hale stopped for a breath. Ranger lowered his head. Emily looked at Caleb. Tears had escaped down the sides of his face, but he did not look ashamed of them. He looked like a man whose memory had finally been taken out of solitary confinement and placed under light. Hale continued. The page noted that Ward's initial statement was coherent despite head trauma. It recommended that Harlan's status be reviewed for valor recognition, not abandonment. It also warned that early sedation could interfere with Ward's ability to complete his witness statement and requested that all patient property, including the transferred dog tag, be preserved with chain of custody. Emily's hand moved instinctively to her scrub pocket, where Harlan's tag was still sealed in the property envelope. The page had not only told the truth, it had predicted the exact way the truth could be lost. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward. That is an unverified copy. The police officer turned the sleeve slightly. It has signatures. The air changed again. Hale looked at the bottom of the page. Emily followed his gaze. 3 lines had been signed. The first belonged to a military medic. The second bore Commander Joseph Hale's printed name beside a field acknowledgement mark. The third was a hospital receiving signature, written in darker ink with initials beside it that matched the label on the fabric from Treatment 7. Marcus Whitmore, not senior physician then, not the powerful man in the hallway now. A younger doctor receiving a transfer packet in a storm, signing for a page that later disappeared from the hospital copy. Linda whispered, Marcus. Whitmore's face had gone still in a way that looked less like innocence than containment. I signed many documents during that event. Hale stared at him. You signed the page that said Harlan stayed. I signed receipt of a packet during a mass casualty overflow. You received Ward's statement. I received paperwork. You knew the official story was wrong. Whitmore's eyes hardened. You do not know what that night was like. Caleb tried to raise himself, but the resident gently held the rail and kept him from straining. I know what it was like, Caleb said. I was there when Harlan told me to leave him. Ranger rose slowly. The K9 did not move toward Whitmore. He moved to Caleb first, pressing his shoulder beneath the veteran's hand until Caleb's fingers found fur. Only then did Ranger turn his head back toward the doctor. The message was clearer than any threat. He was not protecting anger. He was protecting a witness. The police officer photographed the page, the signatures, the drawer, and the envelope. Mason printed the access history showing Whitmore in archives before Caleb's arrival. The guard added the video timestamps from Treatment 7. Each piece entered the night like a nail being driven into a door that had been closed for years. Emily should have felt relief. Instead, dread arose in her because Whitmore had gone too quiet. He turned toward Linda. Secure all patient materials. Linda did not move. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds, but everyone saw it. Whitmore saw it too, and for the first time that night, his control cracked in his voice. That is a hospital order. Linda looked at Emily's pocket, then at Caleb, then at Ranger's blood on the floor. Those materials are already logged. Emily had never heard Linda sound uncertain before. It was not an apology, not yet, but it was no longer obedience. Whitmore reached for the tray himself. Ranger stepped once, placing his body between the doctor and the page. Hale moved at the same time, not touching Whitmore, simply standing where rank and age and moral authority filled the narrow hallway. The police officer put a hand flat on the tray. Do not touch it, the officer said. Whitmore stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with the years Caleb had spent being called unreliable, with the dog tag that never reached a family, with the K9 that had guarded a doorway until men dragged him away, with the rookie nurse who had almost been removed for listening. Then Caleb spoke, his voice fragile but clearer than it had been all night. Harlan said names matter. Hale folded the copied page back into its sleeve with a care that felt ceremonial. He was right. Emily looked down at Ranger. The dog's injured paw had begun bleeding again, leaving a small red mark beside the drawer. He had found the tag, the room, the cloth, and now the page. Each time he had waited for humans to catch up to what he already knew. Mason's printer clicked behind them. A fresh page slid out from the security station, and the guard picked it up with a strange expression. There is another access entry tied to the Harlan file, he said. Not last night, earlier this month. Emily turned. Who accessed it? The guard looked at Whitmore, then at the paper in his hand. Administrative export to outside legal review. Whitmore's face drained of color. Hale took the printout and read the destination line. His expression changed from grief to something harder. This was sent to the hospital board's liability council, he said. Emily felt the truth widen beyond the hallway. Whitmore had not only hidden an old lie, someone above him may have known it was starting to surface. Behind them, Caleb closed his eyes, and Ranger pressed closer as the monitor began to climb again. At the far end of the corridor, a hospital administrator appeared in a dark suit, walking fast toward the gathered evidence, with 2 more security guards behind him. The administrator in the dark suit did not slow down until Ranger turned to face him. His name badge read Daniel Price, Chief Operations Officer, and everything about him suggested a man trained to make problems disappear before they reached daylight. His coat was buttoned, his tie still neat past midnight, his expression set in the polished concern hospitals used when concern had already become strategy. 2 security guards followed close behind him, but both stopped when Ranger stepped into the center of the corridor with his wounded paw planted. Beside the tray holding page 3, Emily saw Price's eyes move quickly over the scene, the police officer's phone, Commander Hale's rain-dark coat, Mason's trembling hands, Linda standing too far from Dr. Whitmore to look loyal anymore. Caleb Ward strapped to a stretcher with one hand buried in Ranger's fur, the sealed evidence sleeves, the printed access logs, the copied page resting under the officer's hand. Price understood in seconds that he had arrived too late for a quiet cleanup. Everyone needs to step back, he said. This material belongs under hospital review. Hale did not move. That page belongs under military review. Price gave him a careful look. Commander, we respect your service, but this facility has privacy obligations and legal procedures. The police officer lifted the photographed envelope slightly. Then your procedures can happen after the evidence is preserved, Doctor. Whitmore seized on the administrator's arrival like a man finding a rope. Daniel, this has become completely inappropriate. Nurse Carter has compromised clinical care, encouraged a psychiatric patient's delusions, and interfered with removal of an animal involved in an assault. Ranger's head tilted almost imperceptibly at the word animal. Emily felt the old anger rise again, but she kept still. Ranger had done more controlled work in the last hour than half the people trying to condemn him. His body showed pain in every breath, but he remained exactly where the evidence needed him. Price turned to Emily. Nurse Carter, are you refusing a suspension order? Emily felt the room waiting to see whether she would defend herself first. It would have been easy to speak about her career, about being threatened, about following chain of custody. Instead, she looked toward Caleb's monitor. His heart rate was climbing again, and his breath had grown shallow as new guards and administrators filled the space. I am asking that Mr. Ward not be moved or sedated until an outside authority reviews the page, the tag, the fabric, the access logs, and the security footage, she said. He has identified evidence before seeing it. His distress worsens when people try to separate him from Ranger or erase what he is saying. Price looked at the monitor despite himself. The resident, still at Caleb's side, spoke in a low voice. His vitals support that. He stabilizes with the K9 near him. Linda closed her eyes briefly. That was the moment Emily realized Linda had heard enough truth to begin hating her own silence. Price tried another route. The dog cannot remain in an active ER. The younger animal control officer finally stepped forward, his rigid leash lowered at his side. Sir, I was called for a dangerous dog. What I'm seeing is an injured trained K9 maintaining a protective position without biting or lunging. Forcing removal could escalate him and the patient. Ranger remained still, as if every honest sentence gave him one less threat to manage. Hale took out his phone. I am contacting the Regional Military Casualty Assistance Office and the Marine Corps Records Liaison. Price's polished concern cracked. You cannot bring outside agencies into an active hospital matter without authorization. Hale looked at him, and the age in his face suddenly felt like command rather than weariness. A Marine was falsely branded a coward. A witness was discredited under medical language, and evidence carrying hospital labels was hidden for 12 years. Authorization is no longer yours alone. Whitmore stepped toward the tray. This is speculation. Ranger moved first, one clean step that placed his body between Whitmore and page 3. Hale's hand came up at the same time, not touching the doctor, only stopping him with the authority of a man who had seen enough men die over bad paperwork. The police officer set his palm flat on the tray. Doctor, stay back, the officer said. Whitmore's face flushed. You are obstructing medical operations. I am preventing interference with documented evidence. The word documented struck harder now because it no longer belonged only to Emily. It belonged to the officer's photographs, the security footage, the access printouts, Mason's file index, the page signature, The hospital label with MW, the dog tag with Harlan's name, and the living veteran whose memory had matched every object before it appeared. Caleb suddenly tried to speak. The effort bent his body against the restraint, and Ranger turned from Whitmore at once, returning to the stretcher with painful speed. Emily moved instinctively, then stopped because the suspension order still hung over her. Linda saw the hesitation and stepped in herself, adjusting Caleb's oxygen with hands steadier than her face. Emily did not thank her. Linda would not have accepted it yet. Caleb's eyes found Hale. He gave me the tag before the door dropped. Hale stepped closer. Tell them exactly. Caleb swallowed, his voice raw but focused. Harlan knew the hinge was tearing loose. Atlas was bracing low, growling at the frame because the metal was twisting. I had Miller under one arm and Reyes half over my shoulder. Harlan shoved me through and put the tag in my hand. He said, "Make sure they know I stayed." Then he pushed the door from inside. No one interrupted him. Emily watched Price's face change as Caleb spoke. Not soften, recalculate. The hospital was a machine, and Price had just realized the machine had produced a record that could not survive the evidence in the hallway. Caleb continued, each word costing him. I woke up here, same room, same smell. I asked for the tag. They said there was no tag. I asked for Harlan. They said he abandoned the rear door. I tried to stand, and they called me confused. Every time I told it, they wrote that I was worse. Ranger laid his head against the mattress rail, eyes half closed for the first time all night. He was not relaxing. He was listening to the truth he had dragged through the hospital in pieces. Whitmore's voice came quieter now. Ward had head trauma. The initial report was chaotic. I made decisions based on the available medical picture. Hale turned. You signed the page that contradicted the abandonment claim. Whitmore's mouth tightened. I was told command would handle the military conclusion. You also had the dog tag. The accusation did not come from Hale. It came from Caleb. He lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward Whitmore's coat pocket. Not the coat he wore now, but the place memory had placed the old one 12 years earlier. You took it from the tray, Caleb said. You told me patient property had been secured. Then you told the nurse I was fixating when I asked again. Whitmore did not answer quickly enough. That delay became its own confession. Emily reached into her pocket and held up the sealed dog tag envelope. Ranger brought it in tonight. How did Caleb lose it 12 years ago if he was never believed to have it? Price looked at Whitmore. The doctor's control thinned further. I did not steal anything. Mason, pale but determined, lifted another printout. The inactive property ledger has an entry for one military ID tag received with Ward's transfer packet. The disposition field was changed the next morning to clerical error. Emily stared at him. Who changed it? Mason looked at the screen. Whitmore. Linda whispered something under her breath that sounded almost like grief. The police officer took the printout. This is now part of the evidence record. Price raised both hands slightly, shifting from control to containment. We need legal counsel present before anyone makes additional statements. Hale's phone connected at that moment. He turned slightly away and gave his name, rank, location, and the words that made the hallway go still again. I have evidence requiring immediate preservation related to Marine Ethan Harlan and former Marine Caleb Ward. Former Marine. Caleb's eyes closed at the sound, and for the first time that night his face showed something like rest. Not peace, not yet, but the easing that came when someone with authority used the correct name for what he had been. Whitmore stepped back. It was a small retreat, but Ranger saw it. The canine lifted his head, watching the doctor with a calm that felt more final than any growl. The regional liaison on Hale's phone asked for photographs. The police officer sent them through a secure address. Mason provided the intake number. The resident read Caleb's current vitals aloud. Linda, after a long pause, documented that separation from Ranger repeatedly worsened the patient's condition, and that the canine had not bitten staff. Her hand shook slightly as she typed, but she did not stop. Emily watched the record change in real time. For years, Caleb's chart had carried the same wrong story from room to room. Now, line by line, witness by witness, the language began to shift. Unstable became oriented to specific historical evidence. Dangerous animal became trained canine, maintaining nonviolent protective behavior. Delusional fixation became corroborated identification of concealed records. Price saw it too. He looked older than when he arrived. The call ended with Hale stating that a military representative would come to Mercy Ridge before dawn, and that all evidence was to remain sealed, under joint witness. The police officer repeated the instruction for the hospital record. Price did not like it, but he nodded because too many people had heard. Then Ranger suddenly turned away from the group and limped back toward Caleb. He placed his muzzle gently against the veteran's hand, then looked at the sealed dog tag in Emily's palm. Caleb understood before anyone else. His voice came barely above a whisper. He wants it where Harlan can be named. Emily looked to Hale. The commander nodded. Keep it sealed. Hold it up. Emily lifted the envelope so Caleb could see the stamped name through the plastic. Caleb's lips moved around a sentence that had waited 12 years to be spoken without being punished. Ethan Harlan stayed. This time, no one in the ear corrected him. At the end of the corridor, the first light of approaching dawn softened the rain-dark windows, and Commander Hale lowered his voice as he gave Emily the last piece of news the night could still carry. Harlan's family had never received the corrected account, because no corrected account had ever been filed. Caleb stared at the sealed page, the dog tag and the K9 who had refused to let the hospital bury the truth again. Then call them, he said, before someone changes the story one more time. Caleb's request did not move through the ER like an order. It moved like a prayer. Then call them. He had said, his eyes fixed on the sealed dog tag and the page that had survived behind a wall, before someone changes the story one more time. Commander Hale did not answer right away, because some promises were too heavy to make quickly. He looked at the evidence tray, then at Ranger, then at Caleb Ward's pale face under the trauma lights. The veteran had spent 12 years asking for one dead Marine to be named correctly. And every wrong chart, every locked file, every clean explanation had made him look more broken for trying. Now the proof was finally gathered, but proof still had to survive people who knew how to delay it. Hale turned to the police officer. No family call until the records liaison confirms the page and property trail. It deserved the truth, not another rumor. Caleb's face tightened with pain, but he nodded. He understood waiting when the waiting protected Harlan instead of burying him. The next hour changed Mercy Ridge more quietly than the chaos that had come before it. No one shouted. No one dragged Ranger away. No one touched the sealed evidence without witnesses. That silence felt stranger than the alarms. It was the silence of a hospital realizing that its own paperwork had harmed a living patient and dishonored a dead man. A Marine Corps records liaison arrived before sunrise, accompanied by a uniformed casualty assistance officer and a military legal representative, whose face carried the practiced gravity of someone used to entering rooms after damage had already been done. They did not come in loudly. They signed visitor logs, confirmed badge numbers, photographed seals, and asked for each item to be presented in order. The dog tag, the torn uniform strip, the K9 patch, the security footage, the property ledger, the restricted file, the page 3 copy. Emily stood back when they began. She had been suspended, at least on paper. Linda had not reversed the order. Price had not apologized. Dr. Whitmore had retreated into a silence shaped like legal advice. Emily understood the message without anyone saying it. The hospital was no longer sure it could punish her, but it was not ready to admit she had been right. Ranger made that harder for them. Each time someone touched an evidence sleeve, the K9 lifted his head from beside Caleb's stretcher, not aggressively, not noisily. He simply watched with the solemn attention of a guard who had no interest in titles. The military liaison noticed and asked who controlled the dog. Before anyone could answer incorrectly, Caleb moved his fingers weakly in Ranger's coat. He controls himself when the truth is safe, Caleb whispered. The liaison looked at the dog for a long moment, then wrote something in his notebook. Emily wished she could read it. Caleb had stabilized enough to be moved to a quieter ER bay, not the psychiatric wing. That distinction mattered more than most people in the hallway understood. The resident documented medical observation, dehydration, stress response, and trauma history requiring verification. Linda typed the nursing addendum herself, her expression unreadable, her fingers pausing more than once over the keyboard. She included the line Emily had fought for all night. Patient remains oriented to specific corroborated events when addressed calmly and with case 9 present. Emily saw it from across the desk. Linda knew she saw. Neither woman spoke. The military legal representative laid page 3 beside the scanned file index and compared the intake, number, date, and signature blocks. Hale stood over the table without touching anything. The casualty officer checked Harlan's name against a secure database on a government laptop. His expression shifted when the record appeared, and Emily saw grief enter the room in a new form, official, delayed, and ashamed of its lateness. Ethan Michael Harlan, the officer said. United States Marine Corps, reconnaissance, status recorded as deceased following storm extraction event. Valor review closed without recommendation due to adverse conduct note. Hale closed his eyes. Caleb turned his face away. Ranger rose from the floor and placed his muzzle against the edge of Caleb's mattress. It was not a command. It was contact. Caleb's hand found him blindly, and the monitor stayed steady. The records liaison read page 3 twice. The second time, he read it aloud into a recorder with the police officer present. When he reached the line stating that Harlan remained inside to hold the exit, Caleb's breathing hitched. When he reached the line recommending preservation of the dog tag, Emily felt the sealed envelope in the evidence tray become the center of the room. The liaison looked up. This page should have triggered a valor review. Hale's voice was rough. It did, until the copy disappeared. The liaison looked toward Dr. Whitmore. Doctor, your signature is on the receiving line. Whitmore stood near the administrator, hands clasped in front of him. The image of restraint. I signed a transfer intake during a mass overflow event. I did not determine the military conclusion. The legal representative opened the property ledger printout. You changed the disposition of the dog tag to clerical error the next morning. Whitmore's silence lasted too long. Price shifted beside him. Marcus, answer carefully. That was the wrong thing to say. The police officer looked at Price. Hale looked at Whitmore. Linda stopped typing. Whitmore's eyes moved to the administrator, then away. In that brief exchange, Emily understood that the lie had not lived all these years only because one doctor feared an old mistake. It had lived because every institution had someone willing to choose quiet over repair when repair threatened reputation. Whitmore's voice lost some of its polish. The military command was under pressure to close the incident quickly. The hospital was told not to create conflicting documentation. Hale's face hardened. Who told you that? Whitmore did not answer directly. I was a young physician. I was told Ward's head injury made his statement unreliable. I was told the dog tag would complicate the family notification. I was told Harlan's conduct had already been determined. Caleb opened his eyes. You knew page 3 said different, Whitmore swallowed. I knew the page raised questions. You knew he stayed. The room waited. Ranger stood slowly, pain running visibly through his injured leg. He did not approach Whitmore. He simply rose beside Caleb, the dog tag envelope on the tray within sight, and held his position. Somehow that made the question larger. Not louder, not crueler, only impossible to escape. Whitmore looked at the sealed page. His face seemed older than it had a few hours earlier. Yes, he said quietly. I knew the page, said Harlan stayed. No one celebrated. The admission did not feel like victory. It felt like a door opening onto a room full of years that could not be returned. Caleb closed his eyes, and tears slipped into the gray at his temples. Hale turned away for a moment, his shoulders rigid beneath his raincoat. Linda covered her mouth with one hand. Mason stared at the floor, blinking hard. Emily felt anger, relief, and sorrow twist together until none of them had clean edges. The casualty office spoke first. This statement, combined with the recovered page and property trail, is sufficient to initiate immediate correction review. Hale faced him. Not initiate. Expedite. The officer nodded. Expedite, pending final authentication. The records liaison added, the adverse conduct note can be formally challenged today. The family can be informed that new evidence has been recovered and that the prior account is under correction. Caleb looked at Hale. Tell them he stayed before you tell them anything else. Hale nodded. I will, Doctor. Whitmore lowered himself into a chair as if his body had finally understood what his voice had admitted. Price stepped aside to make a call, but the police officer followed him, listening closely enough that no quiet instruction could leave the room unobserved. The machinery of consequence had begun moving. It was not dramatic. It came through forms, recorded statements, sealed bags, and people no longer willing to look away. Emily stood near the doorway, still apart from the official circle. She felt suddenly exhausted. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her pocket empty now that the evidence had been transferred, her name probably already marked in an incident report somewhere. She had not saved anyone in the way movies made saving look. She had listened to a dog, refused to let a tag vanish, and asked questions powerful people hated. Linda approached her without the usual sharpness in her steps. I updated the chart, Linda said. Emily nodded. I saw. Linda looked toward Caleb. I should have seen sooner. Emily did not know how to answer without making the moment too clean. Some apologies needed time before they could become healing. Ranger solved the silence. He left Caleb's side for the first time without being called and limped toward Emily. Every person in the bay watched him. He stopped in front of her, lifted his wounded paw slightly, then pressed his muzzle into her gloved hand with careful weight. Emily's throat tightened. Hale saw the gesture and spoke softly. He is acknowledging the handler of the evidence. Emily looked down at Ranger. I was never his handler. No, Hale said. But tonight he chose who could be trusted with the mission. Caleb's eyes opened, and for the first time since arriving at Mercy Ridge, he looked at Emily without desperation. He looked at her with gratitude so tired it had no words left. The casualty officer returned from a call with a folded note in his hand. Harlan's sister is alive. Her name is Margaret Ellis. She has agreed to receive the first update by phone before formal notification. Hale took the phone, but he did not dial yet. He looked at Caleb. You should be here when she hears it, he said. Caleb's lips trembled. Ranger returned to his side and laid his head against the blanket. In the quiet before the call, Emily looked at the sealed dog tag resting beside page 3 and understood that honor did not always return with applause. Sometimes it returned before dawn, in an emergency room that had finally stopped arguing, while a wounded K-9 stood guard and a forgotten Marine's name waited to be spoken correctly. Commander Hale made the call while the emergency room held its breath. He placed the phone on speaker only after Margaret Ellis agreed, and even then his hand hovered near it as if he could shield her from the years about to break open. Caleb lay still on the stretcher, one hand resting in Ranger's coat. The wounded K-9 had lowered himself to the floor beside him, close enough to feel every change in the veteran's breathing, close enough to remind him that he no longer had to carry the truth alone. Emily stood near the foot of the bed, outside the circle of authority, but no longer outside the story. The sealed dog tag rested on the evidence tray beside page 3. Under the ER lights, Ethan Harlan's stamped name looked both fragile and indestructible. Hale spoke first. Mrs. Ellis, this is Commander Joseph Hale. I served with men connected to your brother's final mission. I need to tell you something that should have been told to your family 12 years ago. The line was quiet except for a faint breath. Hale looked at Caleb before continuing. Your brother did not abandon his team. He stayed behind to hold an exit open so wounded Marines could be carried out. A recovered military medical record confirms it. Caleb Ward witnessed it. The K-9 assigned to that extraction refused to leave him. Ethan Harlan died holding the line. A sound came through the phone that was not quite a sob at first. It was smaller, stunned, like grief trying to stand after being pushed down for too long. Caleb closed his eyes. Ranger lifted his head and pressed his muzzle against the side of Caleb's hand. Margaret's voice trembled through the speaker. They told us he ran. Hale's face tightened with sorrow. They were wrong. Caleb turned his head toward the phone. His voice was thin, but he forced each word into the room. Mom, he made me leave. I wanted to go back, but he gave me his tag and told me to make sure people knew he stayed. I tried. I swear to you, I tried. For several seconds, the only sound was the monitor counting Caleb's heart. Emily watched Linda look down at her hands. Doctor. Whitmore sat in the corner with the stunned stillness of a man hearing the human cost of paperwork he had once treated as survivable. Daniel Price stood beside the police officer, no longer managing the scene, only witnessing it. Margaret finally spoke again. Did he suffer alone? Caleb's face broke, but Hale answered gently before Caleb could punish himself with that question. He was not alone in the way that matters. His K-9 stayed at the door until men had to pull him away. Caleb carried his name. That name has reached us now. Ranger gave a quiet breath, almost a sigh, and settled his head back against Caleb's hand. The official correction would take longer than the phone call. It would move through channels, signatures, military review, legal statements, amended records, and old files pulled from places where no one had wanted to look. But something changed before any form was complete. Margaret Ellis heard the truth. Caleb Ward heard someone believe him. Ethan Harlan's name was spoken in an emergency room without the word coward attached to it. That was where honor began returning. By morning, Mercy Ridge no longer looked like the same hospital. The rain had stopped, leaving pale light across the ambulance bay windows. Staff moved more quietly around Caleb's treatment area, not because they had been ordered to, but because shame had weight. The resident arranged continued medical observation instead of psychiatric transfer. The animal control officers left without Ranger. A veterinary technician from a nearby emergency clinic arrived and cleaned the K-9's ear, wrapped his paw, and murmured with professional respect instead of fear. Ranger endured the treatment with disciplined patience, though his eyes never stopped checking Caleb. When the technician tried to move him farther away for bandaging, Caleb's monitor climbed, and Ranger looked at Emily. Not Linda, not Hale, Emily. She understood without needing a command. Can you work beside the bed? She asked the technician. The technician looked at the monitor, then at the dog's controlled posture, and nodded. That would be better for both of them. Linda heard the answer and said nothing. A few hours earlier, silence from her had been dismissal. Now it felt like acceptance, beginning the slow work of becoming apology. Dr. Whitmore was escorted from the clinical area before sunrise for formal questioning. There was no shouting, no dramatic confession in front of cameras, no satisfying collapse of a villain. He walked out with the police officer and the hospital administrator, his shoulders bent beneath the consequences he had delayed for 12 years. Quiet justice did not always roar. Sometimes it simply removed a man from the room where he could no longer control the chart. Price announced an external review of the hospital's handling of military transfer records. The words sounded careful, legal, and incomplete, but they were spoken in front of Hale, the police officer, the military liaison, Linda, Mason, and Emily. This time, too many people heard them for the promise to disappear easily. Emily expected to be sent home after that. She had imagined the walk to her car many times during the night, her badge disabled, her name whispered at the nurse's station, her career reduced to a warning story about overstepping. Instead, Linda approached her near the supply counter while Emily was restocking gauze with hands that had finally started shaking. "You are not suspended," Linda said. Emily looked at her, too tired to hide her disbelief. Linda's face carried lines Emily had not noticed before. "The order is under review. I updated my statement. I wrote that you preserved patient property, recognized a stabilizing factor, and prevented premature transfer." Emily absorbed the words slowly. "You wrote that?" Linda nodded once. "I also wrote that I failed to listen soon enough." There were many things Emily could have said. She could have made the apology harder. She could have reminded Linda of every warning, every laugh, every time the word rookie had been used like a leash. But Caleb was asleep now with Ranger beside him. Harlan's sister had heard the truth, and Emily suddenly understood that healing did not require pretending harm had not happened. It required choosing what came after it. "Thank you for correcting the chart," Emily said. Linda looked toward Caleb's bed. He deserved that from the beginning. So did Ranger. Linda's eyes moved to the K9, and this time there was no fear in them. So did Ranger. Near the records desk, Mason handed the military liaison a final printed access log, then wiped his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The guard who had pulled the footage stood with the police officer, giving a statement that began with uncertainty and ended with the words trained, protective behavior. The resident stayed beyond the end of his shift to help write Caleb's medical summary correctly. Small people, Emily thought, in the eyes of large systems. Yet the truth had survived because several small people stopped handing it back to power. Later that morning, Commander Hale returned to Caleb's bedside with an update from the records liaison. The correction review had been expedited. Ethan Harlan's adverse conduct note had been suspended pending formal amendment. Margaret Ellis would receive an official visit. The dog tag, once authenticated, would be presented to the family with the corrected record and purged Aid 3. Caleb listened without speaking. His hand stayed on Ranger's head. When Hale finished, Caleb whispered, "Will they know he was brave?" Hale's voice was steady. "They will know he stayed." That was enough to make Caleb turn his face away and cry without hiding it. Ranger lifted himself carefully, despite the bandaged paw, and placed the sealed evidence envelope gently closer to Caleb's side with his nose. The dog tag remained inside the plastic untouched and preserved, but the gesture was unmistakable. Mission held, name guarded, witness found. Emily watched Caleb rest his fingers beside the envelope, not on it, respecting the seal. For 12 years, that tag had been the weight of an unfinished promise. Now it was on its way home. Before Emily's shift officially ended, Hale stopped her near the ambulance doors. The morning light had turned the wet pavement silver. Ranger stood beside Caleb's bed inside the ER, too tired to follow but still watching her. "You understood him before any of us did," Hale said. Emily shook her head. "Ranger knew first." "Yes," Hale said. "But knowing does not matter if no one listens." Across the room, Ranger lowered his head once, the smallest acknowledgement, and Emily felt the night settle into memory with all its pain and grace. Mercy Ridge had judged too quickly. A veteran had been called unstable because the truth made powerful people uncomfortable. A Marine had been blamed because a clean lie was easier than an ugly record. A working K9 had been treated like a threat because no one wanted to ask what he was protecting. But the dog knew first. The nurse believed him. And before the sun fully rose over the hospital windows, a forgotten Marine's honor began its long journey home.